It's so great to see all of you here, both familiar and new faces. I am delighted to be doing this, and as you know, I'm usually the person kind of navigating a conversation, not being in the conversation. So I'm going to start showing you some images. What I've chosen are just a few selections from the many conversations we've presented over the past 6-year period. I think we've had about over 100 speakers, and so this is a very select selection. I just wanted to show you a range. Julia will follow, and then we'll sit down and talk to each other. So this is a drawing by Gopi Ranganatham, and you may have noticed a lot of her work is in the outside area here. There's an exhibition of her work. Anyway, she was our very first conversation, and she was with scientist Erez Lieberman-Aden. They worked together here at the Broad, where she had been an artist in resident. Aden said that interacting with her led him to resolving the research he was already working on, helping him to see. And Gopi is still working on the body of work that has evolved from her interaction with the Broad researchers. Going forward, I'll tell you the title of each conversation. So this was Engineering, Science, and Creative Collaboration. Installation artist Janet Eckelman and her engineer, Sam Boyer, were in conversation with filmmaker Sam Jury and her collaborator, science journalist Eli Kintich. And each artist with their respective collaborator engaged in a four-way conversation. Reading Messages in the Natural World, Rosamund Purcell and Sven Berkitz. And Rosamund happens to be in the audience this evening. So photographer Rosamund Purcell was paired with literary critic Sven Berkitz, someone she was collaborating with. And channeling renowned paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, Sven read from the text of Bestiary, which is a beautiful book that was a collaboration between Gould and Purcell. Interspersed with the presentation of the text, Rosamund showed images and talked about her most recent work as well. This is Into the Wind, Georgie Friedman and Carrie Emanuel. So video installation artist Georgie Friedman and hurricane specialist Carrie Emanuel navigated the territory of storms and the sublime and shared their respective concerns and ideas about how storms affect us culturally, historically, and conversely, the effects of human behavior on them. Many questions arose, among them, can art elevate our awareness, and can science demystify phenomena as we seek to better understand what we do not understand? And something very interesting happened during that program, and it's always fascinating to me what happens that is completely unscripted, which is that Georgie Friedman grew up in New Orleans, and was not in New Orleans during Katrina, but her whole family was. So the conversation was was incredibly emotional, which of course I could not have anticipated. You know, emotions and hurricanes, I guess it kind of makes sense. Faces, Genes, Patterns, and Stories, Alberta Chu and Murray Robinson. So filmmaker, biologist Alberta Chu and researcher Murray Robinson, this was then and still an ongoing project called Face Topo, stemming from their interest in the genetics of faces and a big question: a clear but genetically complex trait, could one's face possibly represent a visible proxy for one's genome? Is it possible to eschew the DNA part and just map the faces? So they set out to build a taxonomy of human adult faces by conceiving a global citizen project to crowdsource 3D face data. And their talk was a couple of years ago, and they're still working on this. Creating bridging. Artist-physicist Jeff Lieberman in conversation with Nobel physicist Alan Lightman. So they talked together about a range of topics, including religion and science, in connection with Alan Lightman's novel turned into a play, Mr. G, which is a creation story. We presented the talk at the Underground Railway Theater, where the play was produced. Shown here is Jeff's amazing installation at the Biogen building in Kendall Square. So this is a still. The sculpture moves over, I think, a 12-hour period. On beauty, Emily Eveleth and David Tester. Painter Emily Eveleth and software engineer and researcher David Tester explored the idea of beauty and how it resonates and overlaps in both of their worlds. As a way to focus this huge topic, they looked at aspects of truth, pattern, and ambiguity. Emily is an artist who makes beautiful objects, but is also interested in cultural notions of beauty. Subjective data, Natalie Mybeck and Ari Daniel. Mybeck uses data, specifically weather data, to create woven sculptural structures, and science radio journalist Daniel uses data to tell stories about scientists and science. For each, the data is used in an aesthetic and personal way. And in addition, some of Natalie's physical works become musical instruments. Boundaries of the Possible, Todd Mackover and Kevin Esvelt. And just to explain, this image is something I found on the web. It is not specifically related to either of them, but it just sort of fit the boundaries of the possible. In a world capable of destroying itself, composer Todd Mackover and evolutionary biologist Kevin Esvelt are both interested in helping our society make big and imperative changes. Mackover with his crowdsourced city symphonies, and Esvelt with Sculpting Evolution, which invents new ways to study and influence the evolution of ecosystems. They both continue to be compelled by what they discussed then. Theories, Things, and Creatures, Andrew Yang and Naomi Pierce. Artist biologist Andrew Yang and Harvard biologist and butterfly curator Naomi Pierce explored many of their overlapping interests, among them animal perception, mutualism, and natural history collections. Their conversation alerted us to our place among all of the species on the planet. And I just want to explain quickly what this image is. So Andrew, artist biologist, lives in Chicago, and there's a sort of citizen science project there to collect birds who have killed themselves by running into tall glass buildings. So they're collecting the birds, bringing them back to the Field Museum, where Andrew also works, opening them up and finding the seeds and seeds that they have eaten. And so here is like one bird's intake, and then they're planting the seeds and kind of recycling them completely. So it's, that's a beautiful kind of arrangement, but it's about this citizen science project that he's been working on for quite a while. So. This Land, Laura McPhee and Taylor Perron. Photographer Laura McPhee and geologist Taylor Perron shared their concern for the American landscape and how they each bring awareness to the evolution of land and landscape. McPhee's images invite contemplation about the unintended consequences of our attempts to control and manage nature and how we use the earth and to what ends. Perron uses fieldwork, remote imaging techniques, and computer simulations to discover how landscapes change through time. Poetry in the Ocean, Robert Pinsky and Stefan Helmreich. Poet Robert Pinsky and anthropologist Stefan Helmreich discussed, imagined, and invoked the ocean. Pinsky acted as the poetic voice through his choice of poems, the hub of the conversation, and Helmreich's comments and responses as the spokes. In this way, they summoned the rich history of our relationship to the sea, both benign and dangerous. The voice of the poems iterated the sound of water. Thinking with the Body, Miriam Simon and Jody Weber. Researcher Miriam Simon, who investigates the implications, as she says, of socio-technical and environmental change with the project Training Transhumanism, or I Want to Become a Cephalopod, and choreographer and dance historian Jody Weber, who had then recently been thinking about how trees communicate, had a verbal and physical conversation looking at some of these questions. What does thinking with the body mean? What can we learn from animals? What can we learn from trees? And unlike our other programs, the audience had the opportunity to move and think with their bodies. So there was, the conversation was actually this, physical. And I'm going to end this with a piece by me, which is called Dissipate, Disappear Series. And I thought I would just share one of my pieces. My practice is in tandem with everything I do. This is an installation view of an ongoing series shown here in an exhibition at the Nesto Gallery. And these painted objects are accompanied by a very large, also ongoing group of drawings that capitulate the columns. And now Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia Buntain-Howell, and I'm very happy to be here. I am a suburb of Boston native, but it's been about 15 years since I lived here, and I recently moved back. So one of the first people I reached out to was Deborah, because we kind of knew each other, but not really, and she was one person in town I knew I wanted to get to know better. So really glad to be here. I am the editor-in-chief and director of SciArt Magazine and Center. I am also an artist. I occasionally curate shows. I work at Pratt. I work at Rutgers. I do a lot of different things, but it's all under the same umbrella of science and art and what happens when they get together. So I'll just show you a few of my pieces to start, because what I do professionally very much stems from my artistic practice, which was the first thing I started to do in the world of science and art. Deborah, or Molly rather, mentioned that I got a double bachelor's in neuroscience and sculpture from Hampshire College. While I was pursuing, a double bachelor's, it really ended up being that I started to make sculpture about the things I was studying in class in neuroscience. So that's when I started to make this kind of work. That was 10, 11 years ago. As an artist, I don't see a reason to do anything other than make work about the brain. There's a lot of territory there. If you know anything about neuroscience, you know that we have a lot to discover about the brain, and it's a very good decade and time for that sort of thing. As our technologies get so advanced, we're able to see more and more, but still there's so much to discover. So this is from an exhibition I had at NYU last year. The piece in the middle is based off of neuronal data that was acquired originally from a lab at MIT, and the pieces on the left and right are based on microscopy photos I took while in a lab. Some of my other work is more sculptural. So the things I like to explore as an artist include the beauty of biology, but also how science represents the brain, and if the representation of science has an aesthetic quality to it, which can be explored artistically. So the top left photo is of these brainwave sculptures that I have. So what happens when you take two-dimensional pixels, something that's normally on a screen, and you make it a line in space? That was the question I asked as an artist. The bottom right photo they're sculptures of what are called synaptic clefts. So that's the space between two neurons. That's the space of communication and exchange, and how weird it is that those spaces vary so much. So this is really recent data that's come out in the last couple of years. I stay up to date on what's happening in neuroscience by reading the first-hand publications in the journals. I often reach out to the scientists that I make work with their data, and they're always like, oh, how cool is that? Somebody cares about what I'm doing, other than my funding organization. This is a piece, it's part of a series called Thoughts, where I've overlaid the cell bodies and neurons. I think this one is 23 overlaid cells. So in all of my work, I start with the hard science, and then I depart into the world of aesthetics. So the science is maintained throughout. There's no manipulation here of the form of the neurons. Of course, there's manipulation of color, there's manipulation of arrangement, but it's really important for me that some bit of science gets maintained throughout. And in the end, you have, an aesthetic experience, maybe you dig into it further. But yeah, so that's some of my work. But, before I started doing anything else, I was very happy as an artist, but I had this kind of drive to do a little bit more than that. I became and still maintain a very specific interest in the relationship, in the kind of multi-directional relationship between art and science, science and society and art. There's a lot here. I'm not going to unpack all of it, but how do art and science relate to each other? How do they influence each other? What is the relationship between society and art and society and science? I'd say it's problematic right now. Is there anything art and science can do to improve each of their relationships with society or for each other? I think so. So these are some of the questions I try to address through my organizational work. One thing we do at SciArt Center, which is, I'll just pause for a moment and tell you about what that is. It's an organization. We are based primarily in New York, but we do events all over the place, and we have a strong international community through a lot of the programming that we do, which happens online. Why let national boundaries stop you from creating a collective, creating a group when we have this thing called the internet? When we do physical programming, it's usually in New York, but sometimes other cities, and I'll get to that in a bit. This is from one of our art shows. So we host art shows twice a year, and the theme changes, but it's always something related to science. This show was called The Void and the Cloud, and it related to science in a few different ways. One of them was the kind of wave-particle duality. Another was the kind of digitization of everything up into the cloud. So our artists took various takes on that theme. The guy talking right now is, he's a physics professor at, blanking on the college in New York. His name's Arthur Singer, and he creates these beautiful kind of light refractive prints. So we host these events twice a year. We either partner with an institution that likes our content, or we have our own kind of pop-up short-term space. We're a pop-up organization, so we're kind of here and there and everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This is from another show called Embodied. This was a couple years ago in Brooklyn. We popped up there, and this show was all about how different types of biological science have helped us understand ourselves in different ways. So how do you understand yourself on the level of the cell, or the level of the molecule, or the level of consciousness, or the level of atoms? So artists in this show responded to that in different ways. All our shows are very eclectic. They're always international, and they're always open calls. So if you're an artist and you're interested in submitting, just subscribe to our newsletter, because we do open calls twice a year. We just finished an open call for The Future of Food, which is our next show happening in the spring, which I'm very excited about. This show is up right now in the New York Hall of Science, one of our host partners. Somebody in the room, Anna over there, is actually one of the artists in this show. This is a show on stem cell research, and we curated it in collaboration with the Cambridge Stem Cell Institute in Cambridge, UK. And so this was a really special opportunity to do it at a museum in collaboration with this international organization, the logistics of which you can imagine were a little complicated, but basically we got together this group of 38 pieces all about stem cell research, ranging from being inspired by it to literally being a scientist that makes stem cell research and then visualizes their data and calls it art. So kind of the whole spectrum. A lot of our artists have dual degrees, or moonlight, as an artist by night while they're a scientist by day, or vice versa. Another one of our programs that's recurring is our residency program. So we pair artists and scientists together to embark on a collaboration of their own devising. So this is the 24 people who have gone through our program. We have 8 more in their residency right now. We get in an open call of applications, and we find pairs based on fitness across disciplines. So to give you an example, let's see, Brittany here was paired with Kara, who is right here. She's an entomologist and science communicator, and Brittany is a straight up artist interested in science, but had this sort of sculptural bend, which Kara was interested in pursuing. And basically I read their applications and I was like, wow, these two would be really great together. And they hit it off. And that's kind of what happens with every team, more or less. The purpose of this program is to explore the potential of science-art collaboration in general. We put no rules or expectations on the teams. We tell them we'll support you, we'll facilitate for you, we will problem solve with you for 4 months to see what your natural synergy generates. So sometimes for them it's a series of conversations that are meaningful. Sometimes it's an exhibition or a movie or a performance, but it's always different. And that's because we like to emphasize it's the process of collaboration which sticks with you throughout your entire life. An end product from a collaboration has a shelf life, but it's the process that changes your perspective and you carry forward with you. One of the aspects of the residency is that they keep a weekly blog. So we're also trying to archive the collaborative process. So every week the residents upload a blog and it's just like, this is what we did this week. And here's a sketch of a bug mask, I think is what they were working on at that point, for the sake of art and science communication. We also do other kind of one-off programming, or not annual, but recurring programming. We held a conference about a year and a half ago, exploring various aspects of the science-art convergence. We also have a recurring book club now, and we're going to be starting up a LASER, which is a cross-disciplinary talk series, in the spring with another institution in Cambridge called SwissNex. So I mentioned we mostly do programming in New York. Well, that will change come spring, so stay tuned. The other aspect of the SciArt organization is our magazine. We're no longer called SciArt in America because they got upset about that, they being Art in America. I assured them, no, we haven't made any money that you would have made. We're a free publication, because at that point we were. We no longer are entirely free, but it was a very funny exchange. We're not now SciArt magazine. We also have more of a global focus than we did when we started in August 2013. This is our issue cover from back then. We also used to do print. Now we are an online publication. We have modernized into the digital age where you can read it on your phone, you can read it on your tablet or your computer. We publish about science-based art, third culture conversation, STEAM education, and the like. We take submissions, so about 50% of our content is submission-based now. So I say, we publish about these 3 things, but really it's like, we could publish about something that falls into a new category tomorrow if somebody sends me an email. Of course, there's a filter process, but some of these things up right here, we have a heavy focus on interviews, because I think often what people have to say about their own work, whether it's artistic or scientific, is more interesting than what someone else could say about their work. It's just a way to get a deeper insight into the kind of behind the scenes story. So we publish every other month. We're coming out with the December issue as soon as it's finished, very soon. But find us online, sciartmagazine.com. So yeah, all of this SciArt stuff was born out of my artistic practice, my need and want to explore how science and art can interact. And I won't go on too long about that because Deborah and I will talk all about that, but I will leave this up here for you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. I think what I'm going to do is start our conversation with reading our mission statements, our kind of formal statements to the world of what we're doing, and then we can sort of unpack it.
That sounds great.
Yeah, and as we talked about, we'll also start with a question that each of us will answer, and then we'll just let it go. As usual, I have a lot prepared, but we can ignore it or follow it.
I mean, we could stay here for the next 5 hours.
Yeah, no, we can't. Okay, so Julia's, yours reads, artists and scientists seek answers to the same fundamental questions. Who are we, why are we here, and where are we going? Both art and science build models of human experience in order to extend the boundaries of human capacity. Despite this common ground, artists and scientists are too often separate in their endeavors. So I think we both resonate with that and trying to put things together. Ours reads, Catalyst Conversations presents intimate and provocative conversations between artists, scientists, and the public, sparking collaborations, synergy, and the development of future projects with these communities and beyond. So the first question I'd like us both to respond to is, when did you first gain interest working in the intersection between arts and sciences? So kind of that from a personal point of view, and I'll answer first.
Sure.
Which is, I have had, I think, a very good liberal arts education. And I think that led me to being curious, thinking critically, sort of no matter what the topic. So I trained as an artist, but I was always and continued to be interested in kind of everything. And I was really thinking about this. So I've always mostly read nonfiction. And I happen to be the granddaughter of she has passed, a wonderful person who was a medical doctor, who I think instilled in all the grandchildren, really, fulfilling your potential. But we also used to read science together. For example, one of her favorite authors was Lewis Thomas, and we read that together. I don't know if people are familiar with Lewis Thomas, who was a marvelous writer and also a medical doctor. Anyway, I think that was kind of like a seed that was planted early on, and so that's kind of part of the beginning story. I think a lot of us have a person or a moment or a teacher that, So, what's your response to that?
Yeah. So my moment, it was a specific moment. Of course, during some moments you don't realize what they'll turn into, but in hindsight, everything is 20/20. So I was literally running between the lab and the studio in college. If you're not familiar with Hampshire College, you design your own major and you don't get grades. You can do literally anything you want as long as you do it very well. That's the kind of bar that's set there. So it was a very interesting place to come into kind of my intellectual and creative adulthood. I knew I liked art. I always did art. I went to an arts high school. That was kind of a given. I wasn't sure how much I liked it, but I knew it was something that came naturally to me. But I didn't know I liked neuroscience until I tried out a neuroscience class, and I was coming from a mental place where I was very interested in things like the pharmaceutical industry and mental illness and emotion. It's kind of typical for teenagers. But I was reading a lot of nonfiction books about this sort of thing, and then I walked into this neuroscience class and was like, oh, here's all the hard science behind the stuff that I've been kind of casually thinking about and reading about. And the tangibility of the science grabbed me because I'm a kind of maker by heart, so I like tangible things, and so that made a lot of sense in retrospect. But there was one moment where I was studying for an exam. This was a class at Smith College, which we were allowed to take classes at. So I did have to take some tests, like 4 tests in college. It was terrible. I was studying for this really hard exam at Smith, and I was just trying to get the flow of the blood through the heart down pat. Not very complicated, but it was one of many things I had to memorize that day. And I'm looking at the diagrams in the textbook, and it's like, okay, well, I'm really not going to remember this unless I draw it out, because that's just how I intake information the best. And so I started making these little anatomical flashcards, and I started to get way too into coloring them and certain, it's like, all right, this is beyond test help. This is fun. And that's when I realized, wow, there's something to this about visualizing the science that I'm studying. Not like what I made was anything special, but it just lit that little idea in my mind. And then it wasn't too soon after that I started to make art about what I was most interested in, which was, cellular neurobiology at that point. So.
Very good, a different kind of answer than me, but.
I hated science in high school. I hated it in the dumb way where you hate something you don't know anything about. It's like, oh, it's boring. It wasn't an enlightened point of view.
I wasn't particularly good in science in school, so maybe this is all, overcompensating later, right? So
maybe.
Julie and I were chatting before. I feel like I've learned so much. I feel like I'm have earned at least one PhD by doing this, just a straight up learning curve. So another thing we had been talking about, which is the sort of creation story, maybe the more personal story of starting our organization. So I'll tell mine first, which is I ran into Clara Wainwright. Maybe people know who Clara Wainwright is. She's was ahead of her time. She's still very much around. She is a fabric artist, and she, among other things, invented First Night. Anyway, I ran into her at an opening, and I didn't know her very well. We started chatting, and I was just telling her, I was fascinated, which I still am, the interest of artists in science, not just visual artists, but dancers and musicians and so on. And she was talking about how it would be great to have a forum in the Boston area for all the artists to have a place where there's conversations. And anyway, that is exactly how the idea got born. And she said, we're going to have lunch. So if Clara asks you for lunch, that's what you do. And it quickly evolved from there. So with Clara and with her kind of mentorship, we developed a group of people who were interested, a lot of research, and about a year later, we launched. And to my surprise, that was not the only thing that would happen. That was the very first thing, and that seeded, 6 years later. So.
Who knows what a lunch can lead to?
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah.
The magazine for SciArt came first. I had a kind of secret side interest in the publishing world that I explored mainly through unpaid internships at various points in my life. I never knew where those internships would take me, but they ended up being very relevant because I realized through working for different publications that were successful or not, that gathering together information that I thought was important was something that I enjoyed. And that's a lot of what I do now through SciArt is bringing the right different things together. This is what you do when you curate conversations. It's like bring this and this and this, and there's something that feels really good about doing that on the personal level, but then you kind of let it out into the world, and then it does its own thing, and then it serves everybody else, and they get interaction back. And so I realized I liked that about publishing. The internet's such a crazy place. I mean, it's even crazier than when I started the magazine in 2013. So when you decide to collect information in a meaningful way, it gives it a little bit of a step up from the din of the internet. So that's why I started the publication. Instead of starting something else, I was halfway through grad school, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm an artist interested in science. I know a bunch of other artists interested in science, but I felt like there was a little bit of a lack of presence despite the numbers. There didn't feel like there was a cohesive presence, or at least the kind of presence that I was looking for. So a publication is a way to do that. It's a way to raise awareness about, hey, these people are doing all this amazing stuff. Read about it, know about it, get in touch with them, and it has a kind of rolling ball effect after that. So yeah, and then the events and the art shows and everything kind of naturally evolved from that, because we got a lot of positive feedback. And people started to ask us, oh, can you host other kinds of things? I'm like, well, we're a magazine, we don't like host events, but maybe we can grow and have another branch of what we do. So yeah, I've worked with different people along the way, and who helped make that happen.
Yeah. So just in response to kind of both of us, most artists are working alone. And it seems like it's kind of a leap of faith to go from that kind of interior, kind of singular activity to collaboration and kind of a broad, a broad connection to community. And for me, that's been, has been very rewarding, and kind of an aspect that I didn't like say, now that's why I'm doing it, but it's a kind of a natural aspect. And to have an idea and to manifest it, it's also what happens when I curate. It's, here's an idea about beauty. Let's do an exhibition, let's do a talk about ideas about beauty, which is very complicated and fraught, and
especially if you don't believe that art should be beautiful.
Exactly, yeah. Right. So in fact,
some
that's
people
why
out there.
Emily Eveleth and I had a bunch of conversations before her conversation about beauty. So let's do this. Let's talk about it, and that actually led to me curating an exhibition about beauty.
Very cool.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that's really interesting, and I also think that perhaps for both of us, it was like, kind of a certain synergy out in the world of this being the right moment for doing this. So in Cambridge, Boston area, there are many, every day of the week, there's like, probably 10 talks about science or art or both. And, but I think that what Catalyst are doing is fulfilling a particular kind of space, and continues to do so. And we get along with other people doing programming, but it's not something that is planned exactly.
Well, I think that's I've had my eye on Catalyst for a few years now. I didn't get to come to one until this past September, October.
Yeah, October. Yeah.
But it's an so one thing I do as someone who leads an organization is I make friends with other organizations, because it's a small world and the camaraderie thing is the way to go, not competition. In the science art world, it's there are too many other obstacles to overcome. We don't need to make more problems for ourselves. So meeting other people who are heading organizations is the best, because there's not only this exchange of ideas, but also one of the reasons I've always loved Catalyst is because it supports and fosters spontaneous dialogue. We've all been to one too many kind of talks where there's just the PowerPoint and it's very scripted, and while those can be very informative and very good for a particular function, the art and science talk, there's so much room for spontaneous dialogue. There's so much to explore that we don't need to script ourselves all the time.
As I was saying when I was showing the few examples, that there are things that happen in these kind of conversations that you don't know are going to happen, or you don't anticipate, or it's very emotional, or there's like this kind of poetry that happens. And in fact, I just want to share with you that the Robert Pinsky, Stefan Helmreich talk, Poetry in the Ocean, was something I dreamt. I dreamt poetry in the ocean, and I woke up and thought, that's perfect. I'm going to ask Robert Pinsky and find, Stefan Helmreich, who's an anthropologist who studies people who study the ocean, and it was quite amazing.
That's so cool. Yeah. I wish I had dreams like that.
once in a while, once in a while.
Well, I wanted to ask you. So you've had maybe 100 or so speakers over 50 or so events or something like that.
Yeah.
This is an unfair, horrible question. What was your favorite one? Or what's one that stands out in your mind for a particular reason?
There are many where I was sort of touched by the interaction of the speakers and the subject matter. But there was one that sort of stands out, which was I invited Stan Strickland, who I consider a Boston treasure. He's an amazing musician and thinker. And I had him in conversation with Ani Patel, who's a neuroscientist who studies music. And it was almost as if the words were like not good enough. And it was like they had this musical connection that was profound. And, the audience, and I had spent a lot of, like I do, a lot of time preparing and talking and whatever, and I was completely like transported by their kind of conversation, which was both, verbal, they were talking to each other, and musical. Stan did I don't know if anyone here was, wasn't that, it was amazing, right? And he did this, instead of showing slides, he did like this breathing thing, like his whole body was like a musical instrument. And then Ani Patel was talking about the cockatoo that he was like researching, and and I think it was deeply felt by the audience because we all have that kind of internal sense of rhythm. We all have music inside of us.
It's very powerful.
It's profound. And so I would say that was one where there was, this kind of moment of like everyone like kind of aha.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't, even as much preparation as you do, anything could happen, Yeah. So that would be a standout for me.
Yeah, sounds amazing.
Yeah. So we started, or I started just with visual artists, because that's what I am, but we have happily expanded to poets. We've had dancers, we've had theater people, musicians, and continue with visual artists. And
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In my in the work that we do, there are more visual artists than there are any other kind of artists, so they naturally with us have a kind of distinct presence in terms of what our programming looks like. But we publish and work with people in dance, theater, music, writing. Certainly, I mean, it's silly to think writers don't engage with this. Think about the genre of science fiction, starting in the 19th century. And yeah, some of the dance and theater especially that's coming out it's just phenomenal. And I love the performing arts because one, I'm not a performing artist, so my ability to judge it or critique it is, pretty low, as opposed to visual art where I'm very critical. So I really could just go and, enjoy it and long for the ride. But also with things like music, it's you can walk by a painting and you choose your level of engagement, but music especially, it gets right into you, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
And we've had several. I'd say all the musicians we've had in conversation have been highlights. Really interesting.
Not surprised.
So this might be a good moment to engage you all if you would like to ask questions or comments or anything. And Megan has a microphone.
Hi. One of the things that I can see that science and art have in common is they both sort of have a philosophical purity where you pursue an objective for its own sake rather than trying to produce some result demanded by somebody else. And I think one step towards the results demanded by somebody else from science is probably engineering, and from art maybe is craft. And I think there's a sense, I wondered if you've thought about how engineering, or for a scientist, how engineering fits into this relationship between aesthetic and intellect, and maybe for an artist, is there anything about craft? I mean, craft, I went to school that had an art department, and craft was kind of like, eh.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, design might be a good example
right,
of that
illustration and fine art and painting or something. But anyway, maybe engineering. what role does where does engineering fit into this relationship between science and art?
Well, I'll just quickly answer, and then maybe you have also a response. But the artists, some of the artists that we've presented and artists that I know who are working on a large scale, public art scale, like Janet Eckelman, she has, like, I think he's employed by her. She has a full-time engineer who helps her realize her ideas. So I think she has, she's kind of the visionary, and then her engineer, Sam Boyer, is the person who actually, manifests or figures out how that thing is going to, stay up. There are other.
It's increasingly true. Any big piece of art that you see, and you have that feeling, wow, how is that made? It's made by engineers.
And probably more than one.
Probably a team that's led by an artist that's collaborating with engineers, or they're hired, or something like that. She put up the example of that hanging ball sculpture that Jeff Lieberman.
Yeah.
So I actually used to work for that company that made that, or was one of the companies that made that, and the company is an sculpture company founded by an engineer who was more interested in aesthetics than functionality. So I think there's a huge space for engineers to, do things which are functional, but maybe functional in the artistic way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think Jeff Lieberman is probably someone that fuses all those.
Definitely.
Right, and who had an amazing conversation with Alan Lightman about religion. It was amazing. Yeah, anyway. Carrie.
I probably don't need this, but this is for you, Julia. Your last issue of SciArt magazine, I'm still used to calling it SciArt in America.
Yeah, we all are.
You really explored the issue of relationships between artists and scientists, where the artist wasn't just illustrating the work of the scientist, and you were asking the question of at what levels beyond that can the artist and scientist influence each other and influence the viewer? And I'd love you to talk about
Sure,
that.
yeah. So about once a year, we do a special topics issue where we, normally the content's kind of about this thing or that thing, but once a year we gather content specifically around a central issue or idea. So this past October was how can art influence science? So this question assumes that it can. So that was an assumption which I made based on a few anecdotes I had heard over the years of trying to collect these stories, but there wasn't a thing which had collected all of them. And importantly, most of the anecdotes were not written by the person whose story it was. It was written by someone who had heard it from somebody else. So I was just kind of fed up with not having the hard evidence, as it were. Of course, it's qualitative evidence. It's stories. It's not a study, but it's a collection of 17 stories by scientists. So it's an art magazine written by scientists, which is funny in itself, all about how art or engagement with the arts directly influenced their research and science. So the good example for this context here is the Weiss Institute just down the road. Don Ingber heads that up, and he was the discoverer of something called cellular tensegrity, which is an architectural property of how cells hold themselves together. This made his career, and his impact on the field of biology, can't be described. He made this discovery because he took a sculpture class as a freshman, and there was a line of thought from this sculpture class, from a sculpture he was introduced to, studying Buckminster Fuller's forms, and then something he saw in the lab. There was a kind of connection that he made because all those things happened at the same time. And wasn't to say his discovery was accepted immediately or the road wasn't hard, but that is the story that he tells. And so we have a bunch of stories like that because, a lot of the work that I do, it's, arts using the science as a subject matter, but I think the other way around, the other direction of influence is very interesting, is less explored, has a lot of potential. We're starting to see, you know, artists in residence at the Broad Institute. I think that's really interesting and potentially very fruitful for scientists. So, yeah, it's an exciting area.
Yeah, I'm sure the Broad would agree with you. And my anecdote of Goopy with Erez Lieberman Aiden was he had an aha with her because she was responding to his research and did something that led him to be able to make a resolution. So. Anybody else?
So my question is on Instagram, actually, which I think is the way that most people my age or younger are consuming art nowadays, which is scrolling and seeing something. And there's a scientific process to how each of us is shown certain artwork, whether that's an algorithm, whether that's advertising or something like that. So my question for you is whether either of you have explored kind of the, not scary, but fear that a lot of us have about how scientific processes mapped through technology that become permanent can influence our consumption of art.
Oh, that's a terrific question.
My immediate response is, which I might change my opinion about this in a few years, but my opinion right now is that people always choose their way of engaging with art, and Instagram is another way to engage with art. Like some museums don't allow you to take photos because maybe they're worried about the artwork, but you know, some people are looked down on if you take a photo while you're in a gallery. I take photos of everything because guess what? I want to look at them later and like remember and all of that. Do I think Instagram's the best platform to look at art? No, it's always in person. But at least things are getting more exposure. I don't know. And some people are making a career out of it, which I'm too old to understand how that works.
It's interesting. I just curated an exhibition at Suffolk University Gallery, and all of the artists in the show are painters, and their work is very much about material, but they're all on Instagram, and it's like an imperative for them. That's how they sort of think and function, and yeah. So I think it's an ongoing, or it remains unanswered, your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in progress, and yeah. Maybe we have time for maybe two more.
So I could be one of your teams because I'm a mathematician and I'm an artist. And the idea that people will speak and some inspiration, or where does the intuitive source of inspiration for that biologist came from? He could have been talking to structural engineers and get the idea of extracellular matrix. So the idea of that people will speak to each other and it will be inspiring, and Pinsky will be inspired when he speaks to somebody about the ocean, is of course very appealing. I would be happy to be one of those with more than myself every evening. But then I question, where does things become art? So for 10 years, for example, I was engaged with people who were doing fluid dynamics. And if you go to the American Physical Society conference on fluid dynamics, you will see pictures that are marvelous. They image various aspects of flow, it's marvelous. And if you go to solid mechanics, you will see other marvelous pictures. And if you'll go to people who are interested in dynamical systems, you'll see marvelous pictures. If you look at the Grand Tetons, you'll see beautiful. The question is, where does it end being imaging that has an aesthetic quality, and what does it become artist? Because I can flood your magazine and 110 others or 1,000 others and with beautiful pictures, and pictures that have reminiscent of the neural structures or whatever. They will be beautiful. Are they art? They have deep aesthetic quality to them.
Well, you are asking an age-old question, which I'm not sure Deborah and I can answer in the next 3 minutes, but I don't know what camp you fall in. I fall in the camp of intentionality, and this is because of Duchamp. So if you say it's art because you say, I'm an artist when I made this and I want you to look at it like it's art, who am I to say anything otherwise? Whether it gets in a magazine is, an editorial choice, but there are so many beautiful scientific images out because all these advanced imaging techniques, not only in fluid dynamics, but in, neuroscience, these big colorful rainbow, all that stuff that happened at Harvard. We actually asked the lead guy on Brainbow whether he thought his images were art, and he was like, I have no idea. Like, maybe, but people buy posters and hang them up for pleasure. And yeah, so I don't know. It's very interesting though. It's definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would echo Julia. And I was just thinking about the exhibition, The Beautiful Brain at the MIT Museum.
Go see that if you have not seen it.
The Cabral, they're just stunning, and they were really just, it was his investigation of the brain, of neurons.
But he was an artist on the side, which is why he was able to do such delicate drawings.
Maybe a beautiful representation of water is a thing unto itself. It's both. Maybe it's both. A la Leonardo, I would say. Those drawings of water were very specific. He was really trying to find out something, and they're aesthetic at the same time. So.
I want to ask a follow-up question. Often when people talk about science, they refer very carefully to the process of science rather than the tentative knowledge created by science, which is its product. I'd like you to think about answering his question, thinking about art not as I walked into this room, thinking about it as products that I experienced, but as the process. And I'd be curious if you talked about process, how would you then answer that question?
Good question. Great question. So for me as an artist, I have a very sort of deep interior self. That's the best way you can describe it. And there is something that I'm always pursuing. It's like a shape or a color or a something. I can't, and that is the driving force for me of the process of making something. And I have to make those things so that I can see what I'm thinking about. And I mentioned my kind of liberal arts education. So I'm also like a research person. So if I'm thinking about the void, or let's just say sublime, or some big topic that I think that work could be sort of part of that conversation, then I do a lot of reading and a lot of research, and But I think it's that, and I think in scientists too, you have to be repeating the experiment or the going through that process till you understand what you're doing. You don't know it until the process it's not finished ever. It's always ongoing, And I'd say this is just kind of parenthetical for me. I always think, oh, I'm on to something really new, and it's like this, that was 20 years ago. I was interested in that shape, or I'm interested in that shape, and then I go visit my grandfather's grave, and there's that shape, and you have to be in that place of sort of paying attention and things kind of connecting. I think we have time for one more question. Susan.
Julia, you've expanded your organization into several different types of activities, shows, your residency, and that sort of thing. Deborah, what do you see in the future for Catalyst Conversations?
There's all these great questions. I will tell you, it's very specific. So we've been doing this for 6 years at a certain level, which is changing now. We're actually becoming we are our own nonprofit organization. Anyway, with that and with having, I think, sort of proven our kind of worth, what I really am looking forward to and want to have happen is to turn this or to augment these conversations, which I think unto themselves are pretty interesting, but to do an educational outreach with STEAM education, and connect these kind of conversations with workshops and so on. The other thing I'd like, and we did one, is to also take what we're doing here and do it specifically for companies, so that it's part of the Novartis, or name your company, for their staff as a way of kind of an augmented educational experience. So that's one of the things. And I want to continue to do these, free and open to the public. But it just feels like the next thing should happen. More activity, just more activities. So I think we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank Julia and you for being
Thank
here
you,
and being
Deborah.
part of the conversation. And just a little bit of Catalyst news. We've now completed 6 podcasts for our listening to Catalyst, and Julia is one of our podcast people. We're working on a really interesting spring season, so check our website for updates and mailing list, catalystconversations.org. I'd like to recognize our many wonderful volunteers and members of our advisory and now our new governing board. We couldn't do anything we do without you. Thank you so much to the Broad for hosting us, and thanks all again for coming. So, thank you.